The morning mist hung heavy over the ancient castle grounds as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial red tunic for the final time. After 23 years of faithful service to the crown, today would mark his last day as a member of the Queen's Guard. His weathered hands, which had saluted countless dignitaries and protected the royal family through decades of ceremony, trembled slightly as he fastened the golden buttons that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. James had joined the Guard as a young man of 19, fresh from military training and burning with pride to serve his country. His father had served before him, and his grandfather before that. The Mitchell family had protected the crown for 3 generations, and James wore that legacy like armor beneath his scarlet uniform. He had witnessed history unfold from his post: royal weddings, state funerals, the changing of monarchs, and the endless parade of political figures who came and went like seasons. The castle courtyard buzzed with unusual activity that morning. Word had spread quickly through the ranks that Queen Camilla would be making an unexpected visit to review the Guard before James's retirement ceremony. It was an honor that should have filled him with joy, but something in the air felt different. The other guards spoke in hushed tones, their usual military precision tinged with an undercurrent of unease. Captain Reynolds, a man James had mentored for over a decade, approached with a troubled expression. "Sergeant Mitchell, we need to discuss the protocol for this morning's ceremony," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's been a change in the traditional proceedings." James raised an eyebrow, his military instincts immediately alert. In all his years of service, protocol had been sacred, unchanging, carved in stone by centuries of tradition. "What kind of change, Captain?" Reynolds glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "The Queen Consort's private secretary has informed us that she expects all members of the Guard to kneel during her address today, full genuflection as a show of respect for her new authority." The words hit James like a physical blow. His face remained impassive, trained by years of discipline, but inside his heart raced. In his 23 years of service, the Guard had never been required to kneel before anyone during ceremonial duties. They stood at attention, they saluted with precision, they maintained their dignified bearing as symbols of British military tradition. Kneeling was not part of their honored customs. "Captain, with respect, that's not our protocol," James said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man who had navigated military hierarchy for over 2 decades. "The Guard maintains its position of attention during royal addresses. We've done so for centuries." Reynolds nodded grimly. "I know, Sergeant. I told them the same thing, but the order comes directly from her household staff. They're quite insistent that this is what the Queen Consort desires for today's ceremony." James felt the weight of his family's legacy pressing down on his shoulders. His father had told him stories of standing firm in the face of political pressure, of maintaining dignity when lesser men might bend. His grandfather had served through 2 world wars, never compromising the honor of the uniform. Now, on his final day of service, James faced a choice that would define not just his own legacy, but potentially set a precedent for future generations of guards. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ancient stones of the courtyard. Other guards began to take their positions, and James could see the uncertainty in their faces. These were good men, soldiers who had dedicated their lives to service, now caught between conflicting loyalties. They looked to him for guidance, their respect for his experience evident in their expectant glances. James walked slowly to his position, his military boots echoing against the cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of ceremony. He thought of his son, currently serving in Afghanistan, and the pride in the young man's voice when he spoke of his father's service. He thought of his late wife, who had attended countless ceremonies and always spoke with reverence about the dignity of the Guard's traditions. As he took his place, James noticed movement in the upper windows of the castle. Curtains twitched, and he caught glimpses of faces peering down at the courtyard. Word had clearly spread throughout the castle staff that something unusual was happening. The weight of observation added another layer of pressure to an already tense situation. The morning air grew crisp, and James could hear the distant sound of automobiles approaching. Queen Camilla's motorcade would arrive within the hour, and he needed to make his decision. Around him, his fellow guards stood in perfect formation, their red tunics bright against the gray stone walls, their bearskin hats adding height and dignity to their already imposing presence. Captain Reynolds approached once more, his face grave with the burden of command. "Sergeant, I need to know what you intend to do. The other men are looking to you for leadership, and I have to be able to brief them on the expected protocol." James looked into the young captain's eyes and saw the same conflict he felt in his own heart. Reynolds was a good officer, caught between respecting tradition and following orders from above. It was the kind of impossible situation that military men faced throughout history, where duty and conscience collided with devastating force. "Captain," James said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades of faithful service, "I have served this crown with honor for 23 years. I have stood in this uniform through rain and sunshine, through celebration and mourning, through times of peace and times of crisis. In all that time, I have never been asked to compromise the dignity of this position." The captain nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. "And today, Sergeant?" James straightened his shoulders, feeling the full weight of his family's military legacy settling around him like a mantle. He thought of all the young guards who would serve after him, and what precedent his actions today might set for them. He thought of the oath he had taken as a young man to serve with honor and dignity, never to bring shame upon the uniform or the institution he represented. "Today, Captain, I will stand as I have always stood. I will salute with the respect due to royalty. I will maintain my position with the dignity befitting a member of the Queen's Guard, and I will honor the traditions that have been passed down through generations of faithful service." The decision crystallized in that moment, clear and unshakable. James knew that his choice might have consequences, might mark the end of his career in disgrace rather than honor. But he also knew that some things were more important than personal comfort or convenience. The integrity of the uniform, the dignity of service, and the preservation of honored traditions were worth defending, even at personal cost. As the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, James Mitchell took his place in formation for the final time, his decision made and his conscience clear. Whatever happened next would be a test not just of his own character, but of the values that had guided British military service for centuries. The black Bentley swept through the castle gates with regal authority, its polished surface reflecting the morning light like a dark mirror. Queen Camilla's motorcade moved with practiced precision, flanked by motorcycle escorts whose engines hummed in perfect synchronization. James Mitchell watched from his position in the honor guard, his hands steady despite the tension that gripped his chest like a vice. The vehicle came to a halt exactly where protocol demanded, and the royal protection officers moved with swift efficiency to secure the area. James had witnessed this choreography hundreds of times, but today felt different. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, as if the very stones of the ancient castle sensed that tradition was about to be tested. Queen Camilla emerged from the vehicle with practiced grace, her deep blue coat pristine against the gray morning sky. She wore a simple hat adorned with a single feather, and her expression carried the composed authority that came with royal position. Behind her stepped Lady Margaret Thornfield, her private secretary, a woman whose reputation for exacting standards and unwavering loyalty to protocol was well known throughout royal circles. James felt his heartbeat quicken as the royal party approached the guard formation. Around him, he could sense the nervous energy of his fellow guards, men who had served faithfully but had never faced such an unprecedented situation. Their training had prepared them for many things, but not for this moment when duty and conscience would collide so dramatically. Lady Thornfield stepped forward first, her clipboard held with military precision, her eyes scanning the guards with calculated assessment. "Gentlemen," she announced in a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard, "Her Majesty will now address the guard. As previously instructed, all personnel will assume the position of genuflection upon her approach." The words hung in the air like a challenge. James felt every eye in the formation turn toward him, the weight of expectation pressing down like a physical force. In his peripheral vision, he could see Captain Reynolds tense, visibly, the young officer caught between competing loyalties and impossible choices. Queen Camilla moved forward, her steps measured and deliberate. She had clearly been briefed on what to expect, and her expression showed no surprise at Lady Thornfield's announcement. As she approached the center of the formation where James stood, the moment of truth arrived, with inexorable certainty. "Guards, genuflect!" Lady Thornfield commanded, her voice sharp with authority. Around James, one by one, his fellow guards began to lower themselves to one knee. The movement was hesitant, uncertain, performed not with the crisp precision of trained military ceremony, but with the reluctant compliance of men acting against their instincts. The sound of knees hitting stone echoed across the courtyard like small explosions, each one a compromise with tradition. But James Mitchell remained standing, his back straight, his chin high, his ceremonial rifle held at the perfect angle of present arms. He maintained his position with the unwavering dignity of a man who had found his line in the sand. The morning breeze stirred the plume on his bearskin hat, but otherwise he stood as still as a statue, carved from the same stone as the ancient castle walls. Queen Camilla stopped directly in front of him, her eyes meeting his with an expression that mixed surprise, curiosity, and perhaps a hint of respect. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they faced each other in silence, the kneeling queen consort and the standing guard, two symbols of different interpretations of duty and honor. "Sergeant," Lady Thornfield's voice cut through the tension like a blade, "you have been given a direct instruction. Comply immediately." James looked straight ahead, not at the secretary, but maintaining his respectful gaze slightly above Queen Camilla's head, as protocol demanded during formal address. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, carrying the authority of 23 years of faithful service. "Your Majesty," he said, his words measured and respectful, "I have served this crown with honor for over 2 decades. In all that time I have stood at attention during royal addresses, as is the tradition of the Queen's Guard. I cannot, in good conscience, abandon that tradition now." A murmur rippled through the small crowd of castle staff who had gathered to witness the ceremony. Lady Thornfield's face flushed with indignation, and she stepped closer to James, her voice dropping to an angry whisper that somehow seemed more menacing than a shout. "Sergeant Mitchell, you are in direct defiance of royal instruction. I demand your immediate compliance, or you will face the consequences of insubordination." James felt the eyes of his kneeling comrades upon him, some filled with admiration, others with concern for what his defiance might cost him. Captain Reynolds looked particularly anguished, caught between his respect for James and his duty to maintain order within the ranks. "Ma'am," James replied, his voice never wavering, "I understand the gravity of my position, but I took an oath when I joined this guard, an oath to maintain the honor and dignity of this uniform and the traditions it represents. I cannot break that oath, not even at the cost of my career." Queen Camilla had remained silent throughout this exchange, studying James with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her posture suggested she was reassessing the situation with each passing moment. The courtyard fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the distant sound of traffic beyond the castle walls and the nervous shuffling of the kneeling guards. James could feel sweat forming beneath his heavy ceremonial uniform, but his stance never wavered. He had made his choice, and he would see it through to whatever end awaited him. Lady Thornfield turned to Queen Camilla, clearly expecting immediate support for disciplinary action against the defiant guard. "Your Majesty, this level of insubordination cannot be tolerated. I recommend immediate dismissal and the filing of formal charges." But Queen Camilla raised a hand to silence her secretary, her attention focused entirely on James. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a thoughtfulness that seemed to surprise everyone present, including Lady Thornfield. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, her tone neither angry nor commanding but genuinely curious, "tell me about your service." The question caught everyone off guard. James blinked, momentarily unsure how to respond to such an unexpected request. He had prepared himself for anger, for threats, for immediate dismissal, but not for personal interest in his background. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "I have served for 23 years. My father served before me and his father before him. We have always considered it an honor to protect the crown and maintain the traditions that give meaning to that protection. And these traditions," she continued, "they are important to you. They are everything to me, Your Majesty. They connect us to centuries of faithful service, to the men who stood guard through wars and peace, through times of celebration and times of mourning. When we abandon tradition without just cause, we lose something precious that can never be recovered." Around the courtyard, James noticed that some of the castle staff were nodding slightly, their faces showing unexpected sympathy for his position. Even some of the kneeling guards seemed to straighten slightly, as if his words had reminded them of something they had temporarily forgotten. Queen Camilla studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "And if I were to insist on this protocol, Sergeant? If I were to make it a direct royal command?" James felt his throat tighten, but his voice remained steady. "Then, Your Majesty, I would respectfully request permission to remove this uniform before complying. I could not kneel while wearing these colors, not when doing so would betray everything they represent." The boldness of his response sent a visible shock through the assembled crowd. Lady Thornfield gasped audibly, her face pale with disbelief at what she clearly saw as unprecedented disrespect. Several of the kneeling guards looked up in amazement, while Captain Reynolds closed his eyes as if in pain. But Queen Camilla's expression had changed again, and for the first time that morning, James thought he detected something that might have been admiration in her eyes. The silence that followed James Mitchell's declaration stretched across the courtyard like a bridge spanning centuries of tradition and change. Queen Camilla stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the guard who had chosen honor over obedience, principle over personal safety. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows that seemed to divide the ancient stones between old and new, tradition and innovation. Lady Thornfield's face had gone from pale to crimson, her carefully composed demeanor cracking under the strain of what she clearly viewed as an unthinkable breach of royal protocol. She clutched her clipboard so tightly that her knuckles showed white against her gloves, and her voice, when it came, trembled with barely controlled fury. "Your Majesty, this level of disrespect demands immediate action. Sergeant Mitchell must be removed from duty at once and face the full consequences of his defiance." But Queen Camilla continued to study James, her expression shifting subtly as she processed not just his words, but the manner in which he had delivered them. There had been no anger in his voice, no disrespect in his tone, only the quiet dignity of a man defending something he held sacred. The distinction seemed important to her, and those watching could see her mind working through the implications of this unexpected confrontation. "Sergeant," she said finally, her voice softer than before. You mentioned your father and grandfather. Tell me about them. James felt a flutter of surprise at the personal nature of the question, but he responded with the same steady respect he had maintained throughout the ordeal. My grandfather, Your Majesty, served through both world wars. He stood guard during the Blitz when bombs fell around London, but the guard never abandoned their posts. My father served during the Cold War, through times when the threat was less visible but no less real. They both taught me that the uniform we wear is not just cloth and buttons, but a symbol of something larger than ourselves. Around the courtyard, the kneeling guards began to shift uncomfortably, their position becoming increasingly awkward as the conversation continued. Some looked up at James with growing admiration, while others remained focused on the ground, uncertain how to process what they were witnessing. Queen Camilla nodded slowly, as if his words confirmed something she had suspected. And you believe that kneeling would dishonor that legacy? I believe, Your Majesty, that we honor our predecessors by maintaining the dignity they fought to preserve. The Guard has always stood during royal addresses because standing represents our readiness to defend, our vigilance in protection, our unwavering commitment to duty. When we kneel, we become supplicants rather than protectors. The words hung in the air with surprising weight, and James could see that they had affected not just Queen Camilla, but several others in the courtyard. Captain Reynolds looked up with obvious pride, despite the awkwardness of his own kneeling position, while some of the castle staff nodded almost imperceptibly. Lady Thornfield, however, was having none of it. Your Majesty, we cannot allow sentiment to override proper protocol. If we permit this level of defiance, what message does it send about royal authority? Queen Camilla turned to her secretary, and for the first time that morning there was a hint of steel in her voice. Lady Thornfield, what message do we send if we demand the abandonment of centuries-old traditions without proper consideration? What do we gain if we force good men to choose between their conscience and their careers? The secretary's mouth opened and closed several times, clearly struggling to find a response to such an unexpected challenge. She had assumed that royal support would be automatic, that her interpretation of proper protocol would be unquestioned. The reality of having her judgment questioned in public left her visibly shaken. Queen Camilla walked closer to James. Close enough that their conversation became more intimate, though still audible to those nearby. Sergeant Mitchell, in your 23 years of service, have you ever had cause to question your loyalty to the Crown? Never, Your Majesty, not once. My loyalty to the Crown is absolute and unwavering. But loyalty to the Crown and loyalty to every request made in its name are not the same thing. True loyalty sometimes requires the courage to speak truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. The profundity of his response seemed to surprise everyone, including James himself. He had not planned those words, but they emerged from some deep well of conviction that he had not known existed until this moment of testing. Queen Camilla smiled then, the first genuine smile she had shown since arriving at the castle. It transformed her face completely, revealing not the stern royal figure but the woman beneath the title, someone who perhaps understood better than anyone the weight of tradition and the burden of change. "Rise, all of you," she said suddenly, addressing the kneeling guards. "Resume your positions of attention." The relief on the faces of the guards was palpable as they struggled back to their feet, their muscles cramped from the uncomfortable position. They quickly reformed their perfect lines, and the courtyard once again looked as it had for centuries, dignified and martial, traditional and proud. Lady Thornfield looked stunned, her carefully planned ceremony dissolving into something she had never anticipated. "Your Majesty, surely we cannot simply—" "Lady Thornfield," Queen Camilla interrupted, her voice carrying the full authority of her position. "I believe we have learned something valuable here today. Sergeant Mitchell has reminded us that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. And tradition, real tradition, is not a burden to be discarded, but a foundation upon which we build. She turned back to James, her expression thoughtful and perhaps even grateful. Sergeant, your service record speaks of a man who has given his best years to protecting not just the crown, but what the crown represents. Today, you have shown me that true loyalty includes the wisdom to know when to stand firm. The courtyard was completely silent now, every person present aware that they were witnessing something historic, a moment when principle and power had met and found unexpected common ground. However, Queen Camilla continued, and James felt his heart skip, your manner of expressing your convictions was exemplary. You showed respect even while maintaining your position, courtesy even while standing in defiance. These qualities honor both your uniform and your character. James felt a relief so profound it threatened to buckle his knees, but he maintained his military bearing through sheer force of habit and training. Queen Camilla stepped back and addressed the entire formation. Gentlemen of the Guard, today you have witnessed something important. You have seen that true service sometimes requires difficult choices, and that honor is not always convenient. Sergeant Mitchell has shown us that tradition and progress need not be enemies, that respect for the past and adaptation for the future can coexist. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. From this day forward, the Guard will continue to follow its established protocols during royal addresses. Those traditions that have served us well for centuries will not be abandoned lightly or without compelling reason. Lady Thornfield's face had gone ashen, her authority undermined in the most public way possible. But Queen Camilla was not finished with her lesson. Lady Thornfield, in the future, changes to military protocol will be discussed with appropriate military leadership before implementation. Tradition exists for good reason, and wisdom lies in understanding that reason before attempting change. The secretary nodded stiffly, her clipboard now hanging forgotten at her side. Her carefully planned ceremony transformed into something entirely different, but perhaps more meaningful than anything she had originally envisioned. Queen Camilla then did something unprecedented. She extended her hand to James, not for him to bow over in the traditional manner, but for a handshake between equals, between two people who understood the value of standing firm for principle. Sergeant Mitchell, she said as he carefully accepted her hand, thank you for your service, all 23 years of it, but thank you especially for today, for reminding us all that sometimes the greatest service we can provide is having the courage to stand when others would have us kneel. As James shook the Queen Consort's hand, he felt the weight of his family's legacy settling comfortably on his shoulders once again. His grandfather and father would have been proud, not just of his final day of service, but of the way he had chosen to end a career dedicated to honor and tradition. The ceremony concluded with the traditional inspection of the Guard, each man standing proudly at attention as Queen Camilla moved through their ranks. When she reached James for the final time, she paused and spoke quietly, for his ears alone. Sergeant, men like you are the reason traditions survive. Thank you for teaching us all something important today. As the royal party departed and the Guard was dismissed, James Mitchell removed his bearskin hat for the final time as an active member of the Queen's Guard. Around him, his fellow guards approached with expressions of admiration and gratitude, understanding that his stand had preserved something precious, not just for himself, but for all who would serve after him. Captain Reynolds was among the first to reach him, his young face bright with pride. Sergeant, that was the finest display of military honor I've ever witnessed. Thank you for showing us what it means to serve with integrity. As James walked away from the castle that had been his second home for over 2 decades, He carried with him not just the satisfaction of a job well done, but the knowledge that he had helped preserve something valuable for future generations. Sometimes, the greatest victories were won not by bending to pressure, but by standing firm when standing firm mattered most. The tradition would endure, honored and protected by those who understood its true value, defended by those who knew that some things were worth the risk of standing alone.